It's 32 degrees. I flew to Seattle on Thursday to speak and came back Friday, and it was 50 there when it was -3 at Green Airport. We're used to this, right, Colonel? At least those of us who served in Germany. Well, my talk here is a little complicated, so you're going to have to stay with me. As complicated as it was for Lincoln in his bid for re-election in 1864, it gets to be a little slippery because just think, here's the president and commander-in-chief in the middle of civil war, trying to administer that, sometimes extremely well and sometimes with a degree of mediocrity because of his overweening trust in people who didn't deserve his trust, some of them generals, some of them politicians, some of them people that were his fellow citizens in the North. So in between all of this kerfuffle, I call it, he's trying to manage a re-election campaign, the first re-election really of a president since Andrew Jackson. So it had been a long time since a president had been re-elected. And of course we had a divided country. So in all of this, operations, dealing with Congress, dealing with new legislation, dealing with emancipation, the recruitment of colored troops, he is bombarded with requests for peace. Peace without freedom, without emancipation, just to end the war where the casualties, now we're talking the beginning of 1864, had already been horrendous. There wasn't a home in the North, and the South too, that hadn't been touched by the war. Morning crepe was everywhere. The list of casualties posted on the railroad station windows, telegraph doors. So there was not a family that hadn't been touched by this great conflict. A good friend of mine, Brown University Professor Michael Vorenberg, just finished a manuscript while he was on sabbatical in Chicago and Boston. Like, when do wars end? When do wars end? If you think about World War II, we sort of put an end to that, not in April and August, not in May and August of 1945, but at the end of the Cold War in 1989, so-called end of we got a little brush up now with another madman in Russia. But so wars don't have an easy ending. Did the Civil War really end in Appomattox or when General Johnston surrendered a couple of months after? So that's the point that Mike Vorenberg is making in his book. It's harder to end a war than to start one. Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan are examples of that. A negotiated peace would not work during the Civil War, as the issues of union and disunion, freedom against slavery, were not subject to compromise, mediation, or arbitration. Now, you know how hard that is for me to say? Because I'm a great believer in alternative dispute resolution, mediation, and arbitration. But there was no way that we were going to be able to mediate the war. Either its beginning or its ending, as you shall see. A negotiated treaty with the United States and the Confederate government would have met, right? Would have met a recognition of the Confederacy as a separate nation, something that was anathema to President Lincoln. Because to him, the states really never, the southern states of the Confederate States of America, so-called, that's how he would describe it, had never really left the Union, according to our president. There were several efforts to attempt to bring peace to the two factions, to the two sides that were not successful. Two of the major contenders in trying to reach a mediated peace were England, Great Britain, and France. Now, why? You think they were doing this out of their love for us? They were doing it strictly on economic grounds because England, the United Kingdom, really had need of southern cotton, as did France. And they made many overtures to the parties. And the big fear that Lincoln had, that many in his administration had, is that if he didn't walk softly, we would receive a recognition of the Confederate States of America by both or either France or England, which would give them belligerent status. It would have, in the international arena, with the use of the international law of war, it would have given this recognized country a certain status with certain rights. Parallel today is the effort of the Palestinians to get a recognition by as many countries as possible in their struggle against Israel and a Palestinian homeland or separate nation. So there were not just the domestic problems that the administration had to worry about, it was the recognition that was threatened by England and France. But as it turned out, the British were able to find sources of raw cotton in Egypt and India, and some cotton even made it through the blockade in the South to ameliorate this economic condition for the mills in the United Kingdom. And something else happened: emancipation. Remember that Lincoln in September 1862 issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which was made final on January 1, 1863. And there were many in the United Kingdom that were very supportive of freedom for blacks, and that lessened the political pressure to recognize the Confederate States, and they tried. So really, what it came down to is any peacemaking efforts were going to have to come from the belligerents, from the Confederate States, so-called, and the federal government. Jefferson Davis insisted on an unconditional recognition of Confederate independence, so the chances of a negotiated peace were non-existent. And of course, what Lincoln did with that proclamation, that final proclamation on January 1, 1863, now what was the primary goal of the war after Fort Sumter was fired upon in April in 1861? What was the public utterance from Lincoln in his administration? What was the goal? Reunion. But something happened with the Emancipation Proclamation. The war aims changed, didn't they? From reunion to reunion and freedom. Now, if you look at military history, or history as I've done, and my colleague Justice Robinson, who's sitting in the back here, like he doesn't hear enough from me when we're in the courthouse, it's very, very hard to find in our history when war aims changed in the middle of the conflict. It's very difficult to achieve a war aim advocated at the beginning of the war, never mind changing it to include something else, which is what happened. And that also raised the stakes, didn't it? Raised the stakes of the war, the status of black people, of what efforts would be given to make them free, whether they ran from slavery, whether Union armies and Navy moving forward would free them by their presence. And of course, Congress was a big player in this too. So let's go to '64, and who was appointed general-in-chief in March, I think it was March 9th of '64? Ulysses S. Grant. And great things were supposed to happen. He was received really as the hero of Vicksburg and Chattanooga, remembering his first federal victory in '62 at Donelson, at Fort Donelson. And he hit the ground running with a coordinated national effort to hit Confederate strong points all at the same time, with Sherman in the West heading a campaign to capture Atlanta and divide the Confederacy even more and deprive it of supplies. And of course, the war in the East, the cockpit of the war in Virginia. And that's when he begins to execute. This is General Grant, who I admire very much. Everyone was expecting that the Overland campaign, the spring campaign of '64, was going to wind up to be a lot more victorious than the failed Peninsula campaign of George McClellan 2 years earlier. So even the Northern press were over-optimistic, with banners like "Glorious News, Immense Rebel Losses," and Horace Greeley's New York Tribune insisted that Lee's army as an effective force has practically ceased to exist. Even by the end of May 1864, Greeley remained confident that the war would soon end with, and this is Greeley, the unconditional surrender of the Confederacy. But within 6 weeks, Greeley's mood had swung to despair. By July 4, the two principal Union armies were bogged down in front of Richmond and Atlanta with 95,000 total casualties. A little footnote for you. Every time you hear casualties in that period, say in this case 95,000, use a multiplier of 10 to bring the number to today's population. So that's 950,000 casualties. 30 million people, north and south, resided then in 1860, 65, 300 million now. So do the math. The number of battle casualties during the 2 months from May 5, when that overland campaign started, to July 4 for the Army of the Potomac was 3/5 of the total of the previous 3 years. So the North becomes further despondent with the war, and the New York World, a Democratic newspaper, asked, "Who shall revive the withered hopes that bloomed at the opening of General Grant's campaign?" And I'm surprised at this because Lincoln was known for his sense of timing, his nuance in his leadership skills. But in July, he calls for an additional 500,000 volunteers, and any deficiency would be met by a new draft in the states. If you don't provide the volunteers with bounties or other incentives, then you go to the draft ballot box and you pull numbers to make up the deficiency. The world, with the presidential election approaching, left no doubt that Abraham Lincoln was responsible for these failures. Even Republicans were despondent. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Wells, a Connecticut Yankee from Hartford, wrote, "The immense slaughter of our brave men chills and sickens us all." And then Sarah Butler, General Benjamin Butler's wife, would ask, as did many mothers and spouses, "What is all this struggling and fighting for? Is it ruin and death to thousands of families?" Her question took on special meaning during the summer of 1864. Copperheads, named after the snake, it was the peace wing of the Democratic Party who had opposed the war as a means of restoring the Union and wanted the war to end on a pre-war level. "Stop the war" was shouted in Copperhead newspapers, as some believed that the Confederacy could never be beaten. Beginning mid-1864, the Confederates had mounted a largely successful disinformation campaign involving the issue of slavery. Using allies in the North, the Confederates spread the word that Lincoln's insistence on emancipation was the only obstacle to peace. Reunion and emancipation. And Lincoln's insistence on both as new war aims, or the new war aim, was being turned against him as an obstacle to ending the war. Lincoln knew that it was the Confederates' insistence on independence that was the true impediment to peace, but he failed to convince the Northern electorate that this was the case. So he was hamstrung. The best way to draw the Confederates out of their true war aims was to offer peace only on the condition of reunion, which they would surely reject. But he could not do that, as it would seem to convey a willingness on his part to remove emancipation as a precondition of peace. And he refused to betray, to his credit, or more accurately put, to appear to betray slaves and their allies, especially the thousands of African American soldiers and sailors now fighting for the Union. Horace Greeley, who is not one of my favorite people, could never be trusted. He just changed like the wind, injects himself into the Fuhrer. In July, he launched a quixotic failed peace initiative with great consequences. Greeley said that he received word that two of the Confederate agents in Canada were commissioned by President Davis to negotiate a peace settlement. Believing this intelligence, Greeley passed this information to President Lincoln. Greeley writes, "Our bleeding, bankrupt, almost dying country longs for peace, shudders at the prospect of fresh conscriptions, the draft, of further wholesale devastations, and of new rivers of human blood." He then asked the president to reach out to these agents for peace. Lincoln, the politician, as well as a good lawyer, did not believe that the Confederate agents had any authority for negotiating peace. And assuming that they did, the South's intractable condition for peace was Confederate independence. Yet because of Northern despondence, the president could not appear to rebuff any peace initiative, however doubtful. It was also a way for Lincoln to garner Northern support and opinion by demonstrating that peace could only be obtained through military victory, that once the false representations of Greeley and the Confederate commissioners in Canada were made known to the public, they'd get it. They'd get it, that we had to slug our way through this in order to end the war. Lincoln sent Greeley a telegram authorizing him to bring to Washington any person anywhere professing to have any proposition of Jefferson Davis in writing for peace, embracing the restoration of the Union and abandonment of slavery. You notice the two conditions he's putting in his invitation. Greeley was now on the hot seat because it made him look like he was warranting the agent's credentials, as well as acting as witness to Abraham Lincoln's good faith willingness to negotiate. Greeley hesitated, but Lincoln forced him into action by sending his private secretary, John Hay, an Illinoisan, but who graduated from Brown in 1859, to join Greeley at Niagara Falls, Canada, to meet with the Confederates. Lincoln was compromising his principles of refusing to acknowledge officially the existence of the Confederate government by insisting on restoration of the Union as a prerequisite for negotiations. Hay brought a letter from President Lincoln addressed to whom it may concern, effectively capitulating to the Confederate disinformation assault indicating that any proposition which embraces the restoration of peace, the integrity of the whole Union, and the abandonment of slavery, and which comes by and with an authority that can control the armies now at war with the United States, will be received and considered by the executive government of the United States and will be met by liberal terms on other substantial and collateral points. This document framed all the discussions of peace for the remainder of the war. Setting forth his own conditions, Lincoln also sought to elicit and then publicize, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, what would be the Confederacy's unacceptable counteroffer. So Lincoln thought. The rebel agents outmaneuvered Lincoln, which was rare to do. Even though they admitted to Greeley and Hay that they had no authority to negotiate peace, they released to the press a letter to Greeley accusing Lincoln of undermining negotiations by setting forth conditions he knew would be unacceptable to the Confederacy. The Confederate agents expressed profound regrets that the Confederacy's sincere desire for peace, neutrally just, honorable, and advantageous to the North and South, had not been met with equal moderation and equity by President Lincoln. Lincoln's "to whom it may concern" letter meant no bargaining, no negotiations, no truces with rebels except to bury their dead. The Southern agents urged all to vote Lincoln out of office in November. That was the point, to get his defeat. As noted in the New York Times, which was an administration supportive paper, it was an electioneering dodge on a great scale intended to damage Lincoln by making him figure as an obstacle to peace. And it worked, too. Confederate agent Clement C. Clay, working in Canada, wrote to Richmond that Northern Democratic newspapers denounced Mr. Lincoln's manifesto in strong terms, and Republican presses, among them the New York Tribune, Greeley's paper, admitted was a blunder. Greeley believed that the president had made a very grave mistake by announcing his own terms instead of asking the rebels to state theirs first. He criticizes Lincoln both publicly and privately. In a letter to Lincoln on August 9th, Greeley criticized the president for giving the impression that his policy was no truce, no armistice, no negotiation, no mediation, nothing but Confederate surrender at discretion. I have never heard of such fatuity before. Greeley was also angry at his opponent paper, the New York Times, which was speaking for the administration, that stated peace is a consummation devoutly to be wished, but not peace at the price of union. The affair gave the Copperheads, the anti-war Democrats in the North, a boost, and the Confederates had a triumph in the propaganda battle, if not on the battlefield. Lincoln tried to neutralize this affair by agreeing to publish the results of another simultaneous peace conflict. On July 17, two Northerners met under a flag of truce with Jefferson Davis in Richmond and Judah Benjamin. James Gilmore, a journalist, and Colonel James Jacques of the 73rd Illinois, who was on leave, wished to stop the slaughter. Lincoln had given them a pass through Union lines with the understanding that their mission was strictly unofficial, although they were well acquainted with Lincoln's conditions for peace. Davis agreed to meet with them because he, like Lincoln, had to consider the desire for peace among his own people in the South. Gilmore and Jacques informally stated the terms Lincoln had offered in his amnesty proclamation the previous December, that is, reunion and emancipation. Buy into that, and you get amnesty from prosecution. Gilmore recounted that Davis responded angrily, "Amnesty, sir, applies to criminals. We have committed no crime. At your door lies all the misery and crime of this war. We are fighting for independence, and that or extermination we will have. You may emancipate every Negro in the Confederacy, but we will be free. We will govern ourselves if we have to see every Southern plantation sacked and every Southern city in flames. Upon his return north, Gilmore published the account of this meeting in the Atlantic Monthly. Lincoln approved, as it demonstrated that it was a shift from the burden of refusing to negotiate from Lincoln to Davis. And the New York Times agreed. It wrote that this mission established that Jeff Davis will listen to no proposals of peace that do not embrace disunion. One would have thought that the publicity around these peace overtures would have put to rest the Copperhead argument that the North could have peace and reunion without military victory. It did not, as Northern morale in August of 1864 was the worst ever. In Thurlow Weed's words, he was very close to Secretary of State William Seward and a newspaper man in his own right, the people are wild for peace. Democrats were able to ignore Davis's conditions by pointing to Lincoln's second condition of abandonment of slavery as the real obstacle to peace. From Copperheads to those Democrats who until that time supported the North's war efforts, there were war Democrats who did support the continuation and completion of the war with victory. And even conservative Republicans denunciated the president for his prostitution of the war for the Union into an abolition crusade. Democratic newspapers believe that tens of thousands of white men must bite the dust to allay the Negro mania of the president. Republican editors, too, believed that Lincoln had made the abolition of slavery the principal object of prosecuting the war. The hypocritical Horace Greeley, who 2 years earlier had criticized Lincoln in his letter of 20 million for being slow to act against slavery, now condemned him for Lincoln's insistence that emancipation was a condition for peace. We do not contend, he wrote, that reunion is possible or endurable only on the basis of universal freedom. War has its exigencies which cannot be foreseen, and peace is often desirable on other terms than those of our choice. Henry Raymond, who was the owner of the New York Times and was also the Republican national chairman for the 1864 election campaign, I don't quite see that happening this year or next, as Bill Robinson knows. I read the New York Times faithfully every day until I get to the editorial page, and I move on to the comics. They still blame George W. Bush for everything, including Winter Storm Nemo a year ago, and he wasn't even the president. Not good. So the pressure's on him. On August 17, 1964, Lincoln drafts a letter to a Wisconsin newspaper editor who had previously supported the administration and who could no longer do so if the president believed the war should continue until slavery was abolished. Lincoln writes now, and this is the letter to Wisconsin, "To me it seems plain that saying reunion and abandonment of slavery would be considered if offered is not saying that nothing else or less would be considered. If Jefferson Davis wishes to know what I would do if he were to offer peace and reunion, saying nothing about slavery, let him try me." Yet in the same draft of the letter and in an interview 2 days later with 2 Wisconsin Republicans, Lincoln forcefully explained why he included abandonment of slavery as a precondition for peace. No human power can subdue this rebellion without using the emancipation lever as I have done. Lincoln pointed out that 100,000 or more black soldiers and sailors were fighting for the Union. There would be 200,000 by war's end. If they stake their lives for us, they must be prompted by the strongest motive, even the promise of freedom. And the promise being made must be kept. To back away from emancipation would ruin the Union cause itself. All recruiting of colored men would instantly cease, and all colored men in our service would instantly desert us, and rightfully too. Why should they give their lives for us with full notice of our purpose to betray them? I should be damned in time and eternity for so doing. The world shall know that I will keep my faith to friends and enemies, come what will. Lincoln instantly recognized the contradictions that were set in the letter, the earlier letter. With his "Let Jefferson Davis try me," he never sent the letter. He and many believed that he would be defeated for re-election on the peace issue for not sending the letter. Lincoln told a visitor, "I am going to be beaten, and unless some great change takes place, badly." Lincoln wrote his famous blind memorandum on August 23 when he asked cabinet members to endorse it sight unseen. This morning, as for some times past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the President-elect as to save the Union between the election, November 6, 1864, and the inauguration, March 4, 1865, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterwards. On the day of Lincoln's memorandum, Lincoln received a letter from Henry Raymond. "The tide is setting strongly against us. Two special causes are assigned to this great reaction and public sentiment: the want of military success and the impression that we can have peace with Union if we would, but that we are not able to have peace in any event under this administration until slavery is abandoned." Was the President giving in to such pressure when on August 24 he drafted an order for Henry Raymond to go to Richmond and propose on behalf of the government that upon restoration of the Union and national authority, the war shall cease at once, all remaining questions, including emancipation, to be left for adjustment? Private Secretaries John Hay and John G. Nicolay, who would later write an extensive 10-volume history of the Lincoln administration, believed that the President had no intention of sending Raymond to Richmond, and that the President's purpose in drafting this document was to make Raymond a witness of its absurdity. When Raymond and the other members of the Republican National Committee met with Lincoln and three cabinet members on August 25, the day after, Nicolay observed that they were laboring under a severe fit of despondency and discouragement, almost the condition of a disastrous panic. Lincoln convinced them finally that the proposed mission to Richmond would be utter ruination, worse than losing the presidential contest. It would be ignominiously surrendering it in advance. He could not retreat from emancipation, as it would not only be a betrayal of a commitment, but would also pass for a floundering administration. In that summer, 64, General George B. McClellan and his former commander-in-chief met on new terrain because he became the Democratic nominee for the presidency. McClellan lost that battle too, but not before being offered a new command. In order to keep him from accepting the Democratic nomination for the presidency, he was offered the chance to come back on active duty and to serve under General Grant, and the offer was refused by him because he could not abide by Lincoln's policy of emancipation. It all was irrelevant, wasn't it? When what happened on September 3? The telegram from William Tecumseh Sherman, "Atlanta is ours," and fairly won. Morale flipped 180 degrees in the North and South. Northern clergyman Joseph Thompson delivered a sermon that was widely published and summed up the meaning of Atlanta. Peace through victory. The Richmond Examiner was disheartened that the disaster at Atlanta came in the very nick of time to save the party of Lincoln from irretrievable ruin. Union soldiers were most resilient in supporting this policy, Lincoln's policy, even though many had affection for their former commanding general, McClellan. Most of them, these soldiers that were being sent in the battle to die and fight, had criticized the peace plank of the Democratic Party, with an amazing 78% of them voting for Lincoln, most of them through the soldiers' ballot. This, too, was a first in our country's history for soldiers and sailors to vote from the field. One Michigan corporal wrote, "To elect McClellan would be to undo all that we have done in the past 4 years." A peace through victory seemed certain that fall and winter, with General Philip Sheridan's Army of the Shenandoah winning important victories in September and October. Lincoln was reelected in November. The vote was 2,200,000 for him and 1,800,000 against him. He won every electoral vote except those of New Jersey, which was McClellan's home state. While a significant victory, the North remained a house divided. How does one explain the 1.8 million votes against Lincoln? That's a big number. This is a large number who opposed the president and his administration and who desired peace without emancipation. There was one more effort to end the war by Francis Preston Blair, who was politically connected and became a Republican even though he was a member of Andrew Jackson's kitchen cabinet. With Lincoln's approval, Blair traveled to Richmond to visit his former political colleague, Jefferson Davis. Their dialogue was a secret, but his presence in the capital of the Confederacy gave rise to speculation in both the North and the South. Its purpose was to see if there was some way to reunite the North and South in order to end the horrific bloodletting. Blair suggested a joint Union and Confederate attack on Austrian Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian, who was installed as Emperor of Mexico in 1864 by Francis Louis Napoleon. Neither Lincoln nor Davis were supportive of such an adventure. But Davis did give a letter to Blair for Lincoln to see, in which he offered to appoint commissioners to enter into conference with a view to secure peace to the two countries. That's where the Hampton Roads Peace Conference comes in that you see in the movie Lincoln by Spielberg, where Seward and Lincoln are meeting Robert M.T. Hunter and former Congressman, now Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, and the Assistant Secretary of War for the Confederacy, John Campbell, a former U.S. Supreme Court Justice. Davis hoped and expected that these efforts would fail because Lincoln would not deviate from union and freedom. And it almost failed before it even started because the Union troops were not even going to let the Confederate delegation in through the lines to reach Hampton Roads. But to his credit, General-in-Chief Grant, demonstrating shrewd political acumen that he has not been heretofore credited, telegraphed the President, "I am convinced upon conversation with Messrs. Stevens and Hunter that their intentions are good and their desire sincere to restore peace and reunion. I am sorry, however, that Mr. Lincoln cannot have an interview with them. I fear now that their going back without any expression from anyone in authority will have a bad influence." This is all Lincoln needed to hear. He decided to go to Virginia to join Secretary of State Seward for a meeting with the commissioners. The extraordinary informal 4-hour meeting of the 5 men took place on February 3 aboard the steamer River Queen. No record was kept and no aides were present. Despite the stress, the mood was relaxed. Lincoln and Stevens had been fellow Whigs in Congress 20 years earlier. But Lincoln had insisted on the terms that he had said all along: the restoration of the national authority, no receding by the executive of the United States on the slavery question. Stevens tried to divert this by mentioning the Mexican project, which Lincoln quickly disapproved. But what about an armistice while peace negotiations took place? Lincoln would not accede because of the third condition. What about official negotiations while the war continued? He noted that even King Charles I had entered into agreements with rebels in arms during the English Civil War. Lincoln replies, "I do not profess to be posted in history. All I distinctly recollect about the case of Charles I is that he lost his head." Lincoln did promise generous treatment of Confederate leaders using his power of pardon. In fact, Lincoln went so far as to suggest that if the Confederate States abolished slavery, he would seek some compensation, which had been one of his tactics since the beginning of the war, because we still had 4 slave states that stayed in the Union, remember? Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. With the passage of the 13th Amendment by the House of Representatives 3 days earlier, with several states already ratifying it, including Rhode Island, the second after Illinois, to ratify the 13th Amendment, Lincoln insisted that slavery was dead. And of course, the Confederate commissioners again had no authority to agree to the death of the Confederate States of America. President Davis was neither surprised nor disappointed and used Lincoln's terms described as degrading submission and humiliating surrender. Would it be possible that Americans in 1861 would have chosen a different course if they had known that the war to which they entered would last 4 years and cost 750,000 lives, 7.5 million by today's ratio? Lincoln was inaugurated for a second term on March 4, 1865, and was committed to Union victory no matter the cost or how long it took. The war would continue until the best inaugural address ever given by a president, until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. It didn't take that long. 3 months after Jefferson Davis had breathed defiance to His Majesty Abraham I, the ex-Confederate Ordnance Chief Hosea Gorgas announced his nation's epitaph: "The calamity which has fallen upon us in the total destruction of our government is of a character so overwhelming that I am as yet unable to comprehend it." Thank you very much. Questions? Bill? We talk about this all the time. Someone else? Oh, yeah.
Sure. A lot of issues in this, obviously.
I'm glad you stayed with me, because this...
I've been doing this for a while. But one of the questions is Lincoln's support of slavery. So we can question how to develop things of that nature. I don't want to get into that because that would take us a week or so. Please. But one of the questions that is raised is he initially stated that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it existed. Wouldn't that have been, and I'm not suggesting it should have been, wouldn't that have been a point of negotiation? Now, I know the implications of allowing slavery to continue, maintain, because there was a political power in slavery, obviously, free fifths, compromise, etc. But wouldn't that have made some sense for Lincoln to be, or for the South to recognize that, he's going to allow it to stay as it's defined in the Constitution? And I'm just looking for, as you said, ways to negotiate, or they could have negotiated this. I'm glad they didn't, but I'm just saying.
No. That's from the first inaugural address on March 4, 1861, where he said yet again, it wasn't the first time, he had said Republicans were not against slavery where it existed. Morally, they were against it, but legally, they were not against it. They were against the extension of slavery into the territories. That was the dividing line. Now, no, because there were Northern Republicans that suggested that to Lincoln before the war started, and he says, no, there is no way we're going to give on the no extension policy. No way. Now, on the other hand, the Confederacy, even though this first inaugural was a carrot and stick, this was one of the carrots, along with enforcing a terrible fugitive slave law that had been passed in 1850 to permit slave owners to grab, really kidnap, apprehend freed slaves in the North and bring them back. Lincoln was for that, would support that, and he says it in the first inaugural. But what the South saw, in addition to a black Republican, that's how they described Lincoln or any Republican candidate, was the ultimate demise of the slavery institution. Lincoln thought, and it said publicly, that he expected it to die a natural death by the beginning of 1900. Well, that's all the South had to hear. And that led the fire eaters of all the states. Remember, 7 states had already seceded from the Union by March 4, 1861, before he said it again that he wouldn't interfere with slavery where it already existed. This is what I meant earlier, where it was impossible to mediate. And I think about this all the time as a mediator and judge and someone who has been studying Lincoln since I was a boy. And it really was something that had been going on, I think, since the first boatload of slaves were brought to Jamestown in 1619, and then the accumulation and growth. And the fact that slavery, in and of itself, became such an economic engine for the section. And they couldn't afford any retreat from that, any back down from that was threatening. This is why they controlled the Senate for all those decades and the White House for decades, in order to make sure that their institution was protected. Yes, Bill.
I just want to make a statement to the audience. As a native Rhode Islander, just as a private citizen, we are truly fortunate in this state to have your presence day after day. You are a wonderful human being and a true scholar, and I feel privileged to know you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I didn't pay him to say that, although we have a very close relationship, and when Judge Robinson came to the court, I was your chief and proud of it. And I've said many times to Bill, to Justice Robinson, when we were in conference, after we got through talking the preliminaries, the baseball, football, who was the best president, that he raised our intellectual level by meters. And it was great because, you know, you're thinking of these cases and the people that they will affect, that the decisions will affect, because they're not just cases, Jones versus Abbott. There are people behind these cases. And so it's stressful. So to get the relief of good intellectual discourse is a great relief from the tenseness of deciding these cases. And one of the things we've tried to do, Bill and I and the rest of the court, is open up our courts for the public to see and to become more user-friendly so people aren't so intimidated by the process. Because, and Bill knows, Judge Robinson knows that when I was on the Superior Court, served a great time here at Washington County Superior Court and other counties, and when I became your chief, that I would tell my judges and lawyers that, listen, this isn't for us. What we do is not for us. It's for the people. They are the ones who count here. And I think, Judge, you and our colleagues on the Supreme Court constantly hold that in mind when you sit in that room, in the conference room. And if you come to the court, Judge Robinson and I will show you where we deliberate in our small but intimate courtroom. Yes?
Absolutely, yes. One thing we miss these days is your fine cooking.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Colonel.
Just a question. I remember in part of your talk.
This is a fellow Vietnam veteran with me. But I got out to go to law school. I sold out for filthy lucre, my accountant says. But he stays in. He stays in Iraq. A short break, then he goes in. So a true patriot. Thank you for your service. I also married his daughter. That is, I married his daughter and her fiance. What is it, Bill?
At one point you talked about Lincoln not budging on the two main topics, but would kind of slide or whatever. What were some of those other areas?
You mean what? You mean be more political than.
Well, the two things you wouldn't budge on were slavery and reunification, but I think you said at one point that he would look at some other areas more favorably, or.
Well, not with those, not
right,
with,
right.
but
What were the other things that?
Well, on like the punitive punishment to those who were really in rebellion. They were traitors. I mean, Lincoln was quoted as saying that Robert E. Lee was a traitor to his country, that had nurtured him for the colonelcy. He was a colonel. He resigned his commission, took up arms against the United States, so he would treat them favorably. In fact, he told, when the war was approaching an end and they were all wondering, the administration was wondering how to deal with these former Confederates, and Lincoln used, as he was often do, it'd be like a barnyard where they, like ducks, let them shoo, like leave the country. He didn't want to go through military trials, so that was in the play. Compensation for slave owners who were not prescient enough to take him at his word, because the 4 slave states that I mentioned that stayed in the Union, and when the 13th Amendment was adopted in 1865, what did they get for their so-called property? They got this: billions of property, billions of dollars. And also, where he would be flexible more than the radical Republicans in the Congress, was on the conditions to bring these states back into the Union. So he would be flexible on that. Unfortunately, he didn't live to implement a policy of rapprochement, of mediation on these other issues that could now be mediated. But that's a subject for another talk, because this year, in 2015 is also the 150th anniversary of the regicide, of his assassination on April 14. And the apprehension of and military trials of those conspirators. John Wilkes Booth had already been killed in Virginia, who were involved with this regicide. But that's for another day. Yes, sir.
So what were the circumstances of McClellan leaving the Army? Was he cashiered, or did he resign and becoming a candidate?
I don't think, it was a lot easier to do back then than now, but he was relieved finally after he failed to follow up his victory at Antietam. You know what Lincoln said about him. He had a case of the slows. And Lincoln gave him, he gave him in his mind a time to act. There were all kinds of excuses, and he just replaced him with Ambrose Burnside, a Rhode Islander, as a commander of the Army of the Potomac. He had no one else, because even Burnside said he was not fit to command an army, and he proved correct at Fredericksburg. So he just really disappeared, like Burnside left just before Appomattox. But so he could get recalled, or he could be chosen as a Democratic nomination for the presidency. That's what happened in his case. He did become governor for one term in New Jersey, McClellan, and he's buried in Trenton. I've been to his grave.
Governor sometime between when he left the Army?
No, after the war.
Oh, after the war?
After the war. He still had a lot of support. 1 million, 1.8 million voting for him. He still had a lot of support. But he's another one that's on the top of my list of no-gooders, like Horace Greeley. And he becomes more detestable with passing time. In fact, Stephen Sears, who's a Connecticut guy, a great teacher and author, wrote the definitive book on McClellan, and he later wrote an edited version of all of McClellan's documents, letters and stuff. Even he, by the time he was through writing the biography, disliked his own subject, which is unusual when you're a biographer. Not a good man. Not a good man. He wasn't loyal to Lincoln, and he was insubordinate and inept. He did help reorganize the Army of the Potomac, which needed it after the defeat at Bull Run. But you've got to do more with an army than have great, grand reviews. Results count, right? Anyone else? Thank you all very much. Okay, Linda.
Thank you.
Did you
Do I
worry I
hear
wasn't going
another-
to show?
Oh, I always do, but you always come through.
Yeah.
I knew we had corresponded this week, so I knew I was on your
I had to
radar.
fly to Seattle at Thursday, and I came back Friday. So I'm still getting over
Pacific
the jet.
time.
Yeah.
To have Pacific
Yeah.
time messes your brain.
Did you
But-
see Mount Rainier outside?
I did, as I flew out too.
Yeah, well, it was the first time I'd ever been to Seattle. It was in June. I look out my window. Oh my
Yeah.
God.
Yeah,
gorgeous.
it's right there, right
Well,
there.
thank you for joining us.